Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our study of world religions. So far we've looked at Christianity, we've looked at Buddhism, and today we're going to be looking at Islam, which has an equal sort of significance in terms of the history of the world as the other two, and affecting a wide variety of cultures in just the same way by spreading a sort of universal message. Now, the interesting thing with this one is with Christianity, we had something that's very well known in modern American culture, whether or not that's the culture you consider yourself to be a part of or not. With Buddhism, we had something that's less familiar to standard American culture. With Islam, we may feel like we know Islam, but there's actually a lot of sort of stereotypes and misinformation about Islam out there. So what I want to do in part is to sort of clear things up and get a clear historian's look at what is Islam and what is it all about? Because some of us, we might think we know it, but actually there's a lot more to the story. Or you might know it really well, in which case, hopefully I can do it justice and talk about it clearly and precisely and sort of clear up some of the miscommunication around the Islamic religion. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at the history of Islam. All right, so let's jump over to the PowerPoint here. And actually, I think I'm going to boot up the Google Earth here once again, because I think that would actually be helpful. So bear with me here. It might take some seconds to load here. So we're waiting for that to load. Let's see. Is it loading? Come on. There we go. So while we're waiting on that, this is the part of the world that we're going to be looking at today. This is the area of Arabia. And this is the origin of Islam. But as we're going to see, it has a lot of connections to Christianity and Judaism as well. So what I want to do with the Google map is pull that up here and show you, just to make it super clear, exactly what part of the world we're talking about here. Okay, so going back here, going back to our favorite, the Mediterranean over here, which has been quite influential. All right, so you may be recognizing this already. So we have Mesopotamia over here. We have the area of the Holy Land over here, also known as Israel or the Levant, this area over here. And, with many names actually. And here is Arabia. Now this is where Islam is going to start. And Arabia is mostly desert, as you can see from the map here, but there are settlements along the mountains. And in Arabia, a lot of people emerged who had learned to work with the desert, to travel through the desert using caravans, using camels. You see a similar story over here in the Sahara in Africa. And this Arabian Peninsula is in between Africa and what's considered Asia, very close to Iraq over here and Iran or Persia over here. And so we should expect to have settlements along the different oases and mountains here, some along the coastline as well. And that is exactly what we see. And the people who live in Arabia are, or lived at Arabia back in the time of the Greeks and Romans, were known as Arabs. And that is still sort of the most well-known ethnicity of Arabia today. And basically, the origin of Islam has a lot to do with the Arabian culture. And so it's hard to say how unified the Arabs were at the time of the creation of Islam. We know that there were a lot of different groups, a lot of different tribes, some call them. And what they were nomads, like other cultures that we've seen in this course, like the Jews originally and other cultures later on. We see that the Arabs were nomads. They were traveling around with their camels, trading quite a lot, trading gold and resources that could be found in the desert with other cultures. They had quite a deal on incense and various kinds of incense and spices and things like that. And they would trade with other parts of the world, trade to the east, trade to the north, trade with Egypt, all over the place. So that's sort of the background here. And then about 200 years after Rome was seriously falling apart, which I would say is the 400s, we get to the 600s. And in the 600s, something pretty special happens in Arabia, the invention of a new religion. And important to our story are going to be two cities here, Mecca and Medina. So here's some of the significant cities in this area. And then Mecca is over here, and Medina is to the north. So if you look at where these correspond to, these are, again, in the mountains where you're out of the desert somewhat. So these are the places where we're going to see more permanent long-term settlements. But this is going to happen to someone who was a trader and a traveler, and an Arab, part of this culture, but someone who would go into the desert and try to become closer to God. We know that the Arabs were influenced by both Jewish and Christian traditions, and that there was a sort of an original Arabic pagan religion, which is now pretty much gone. But back at the time, there were a lot of different influences on Arabic culture. And this individual would go out and try to connect with God, the same God that Christians and Jews worshipped. And in 632 CE, he had a revelation. Oh, sorry, in 610, he had a revelation. 632 is an important date for another reason. I'll explain that in a second. But in 610, he has this revelation from God. He is meditating at a cave called Hira, not too far from this holy city of Mecca, where there was a lot of religious activity already. And Muhammad receives this revelation from God through the angel Gabriel, or Jibril. The angel tells him, communicates this message of what God wants the world to understand. Tells Muhammad, basically, this is how you do it. This is how people should live their lives. This is the way that people should do things, and this is the kind of relationship people should have with God. I'm going to tell you the whole thing right here, right now. Muhammad initially doesn't tell anyone about this. He doubts whether he is worthy to have this revelation, and he devotes himself to prayer and to spiritual practices, hardcore, for about 3 years. And at the end of the 3 years, he feels that he is living the life that is right with God. And he feels comfortable to begin sharing his message from God about how people should live. And he becomes known as a prophet, the prophet to the Arab tribes. And people are pretty soon listening to what he has to say. Unfortunately for him, maybe they're listening a little too well, because he gets in trouble with the authorities in Mecca. The people who own the city don't like his hard religious stances on things, and they try and exile him and his followers from the city. So he goes to the city, which is now known as Medina. So he goes to the north, and he continues spreading his message. And after a little while, he's built up allies and he's built up an army. So he brings his army into Mecca and conquers Mecca and establishes the new religion of Islam as the official religion of Mecca. And he does some bold moves. He gets rid of some of the old pagan religion that was there, that is the polytheistic religion that worshipped multiple gods. He takes those holy sites and he clears out the old shrines, and he makes them holy sites for this new religion of Islam. And 632 is when Muhammad died. And by that point, 22 years later, most of Arabia had converted to Islam. So this became the religion of the region. And these desert people were starting to become more unified with a sort of overall culture, with something that united them. But Islam wasn't just going to be a folk religion of the Arabs. It was going to be a world religion. It was going to have a message that should be spread to everyone, because it has messages about the right way to live. And we'll get into that in just a second. I wanted to show you real quick another map of the different cities that were involved. Something I didn't go into is that Muhammad actually crossed over with his followers, crossed over the Red Sea at one point, and spread his message over here as well. in more of the area of Africa. But these various cities of Arabia, many of them became significant Muslim holy sites. But Muhammad, when he was exiled to Medina, he came back, and to this day, Muslims commemorate his return with a journey to Mecca of their own. But we'll get into that in just a second. So what is Islam all about? What was this message from God that Muhammad delivered? I think the best way to think of Islam in terms of what we studied so far is as a reforming movement. Basically saying, you know, we've got Jews arguing with Christians who are arguing with pagans. We've got a million different types of Christians that were quite proliferating at this point. And so in general, it seems like there's a lot of confusion on the way that people should live. And, you know, Christianity was supposed to make things clearer, but it didn't. And Judaism was supposed to make things clearer, but it didn't. So Islam is going to clarify what kind of relationship should people actually have with God, and what are the things that God wants of human beings. And Islam means submission to the will of God, but you might translate it in other ways too, like surrender, giving, sort of letting go of your own self and following the path that God wants. That's basically the core idea there. And it continues a lot of ideas of both Christianity and Judaism as an Abrahamic religion. That is a religion that believes in the contract that God made with a Jewish guy named Abraham. Islam is sort of the continuation of that idea further. And one of the Christian ideas that is really incorporated in it is this idea of God has this plan to punish the evildoers and reward the good. This idea of heaven and hell, some sort of paradise and some sort of place of punishment. But Islam contrasts with Christianity in saying that there is only one God, who is sometimes called Allah. That's just the Arabic word for God. So it could be translated either way. And the contrast is with the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Christianity has God exists in three parts: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And Muhammad and his followers took a look at that and said, well, that doesn't really quite make sense to us, because wasn't the whole point that there was supposed to be only one God? So this God in three parts business is a little weird. That was their take on it anyway. And so God is simply God. There is one God. And the other aspect of this is that there's not an incarnation in God, as Christians think of Jesus Christ. There's simply God, and there are prophets who can communicate the messages of God, but not, different aspects of God. And the idea of Islam, it basically says that this is what God has sort of been trying to get across to human beings, this eternal truth, but people misunderstood it. People didn't quite get what the prophets were saying. So Muhammad is actually the final prophet, the last revelation from God, who's setting the record straight. And the interesting thing is that there are other prophets in Islam, including many of the leading Jewish figures who are thought of as prophets, like Abraham and Moses, but also Jesus as known from Christianity. To the Muslim way of thinking, Jesus is a prophet and not God himself. And that was a misunderstanding that people had about God. And so Jesus is actually one of the important prophets, and Jesus is a significant figure in Islam. It's just that he is not considered God. He's considered a prophet. So that's pretty interesting right there in terms of contrasting with the Christian perspective. But the core ideas of Islam, there's a very handy way to sum them up, which is the 5 pillars of Islam. 5 fundamental ideas that are very important to the way Muslims should live. And, if you learn nothing else as a Muslim, you learn these. The first one is the declaration of belief. I believe, or I testify, that there is one God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, or Muhammad is the prophet of God. Though that's the core idea we just talked about. There's only one God, and there's one final prophet, Muhammad, who is the prophet of God. So if you can say that, if you can make that declaration, you are fitting the bill to be a Muslim. The next pillar of Islam is daily prayers. which is very, very interesting in terms of the way, compared to the way the Christians think about prayer is something that you do sometimes. For Islam, it's something that's supposed to guide your day, at least in the traditional way of going about Islam. You pray at dawn, noon, afternoon, sunset, and in the middle of the night. So you have 5 prayers a day, and this helps you connect with God. And this, you do them on a prayer rug quite frequently, facing the holy city of Mecca, to sort of unify Muslims around the world under this core idea of connecting with God. Charity. Now this is continuing some ideas that we saw in Christianity as well. That this idea of taking care of people and taking care of the poor. But Islam makes a very specific claim about how you do that. All Muslims must give at least 1/40 of their income to the poor and those in need. So there's a certain percentage at a minimum set aside to help those in need. So taking care of people, doing charity is very important. Then there's fasting. Now fasting is only done during the holy month of Ramadan, which is probably, I want to say, the biggest Muslim holiday. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I think so. Fasting, you fast during the daytime and only eat at night. This is a sort of way of, practicing your discipline, I guess you could say, and showing that you have this sort of willpower in your connection to God. And then in the night after the sun sets, there are festivals and feasts, but fasting during the day. The final one is quite cool. It's the pilgrimage. All Muslims must make a pilgrimage, a journey to the holy city of Mecca at least once in their lifetime. And this is a way of reenacting Muhammad's return to the city. And this is a path that will take you all the way to the shrines that has been set up in the center of Mecca, and join a huge crowd of other Muslims doing the same thing. Now, if you can't afford to travel, that's understandable. And again, there's that principle of charity. Other Muslims will maybe try to pay for your journey. And on top of that, there are exceptions for those who are physically unable, if they are disabled, or if they still can't afford to make the journey. But ideally, this is a way of sort of unifying Muslims and making this journey as a Muslim. And at that shrine, you have the Kaaba. So the Kaaba was originally a place where idols, which is just basically a word for polytheistic statues of ancient religions, originally idols were kept there. Muhammad kicked them out, purified the area, and made it into the center of Islam instead. And so this is the ultimate final destination of the pilgrimage. It contains a sacred black stone, which is sometimes said to have fallen from heaven, which makes some people think it might be a meteorite. It was said to have been used as an altar by Adam and Eve, their way of worshiping God, which is a really cool concept. And so, giving yourself to God is the path that you follow here, and that is the ultimate goal of making the pilgrimage. And if we zoom out here, we can see just how many Muslims are here at the mosque, and the sacred garb that all the worshipers wear, all wearing white, being unified in that way as well. It's quite impressive and quite cool to see how much they fill up the sacred mosque in Mecca. So those are the 5 pillars. But we can talk a little bit more about some other things that appear in Islam as well. The Muslim holy book is the Quran, and the Quran means the recitation. So this is what Muhammad recited, and then it was later written down. He memorized what God had told him through the angel Gabriel, and then only later was it written down. And there's an emphasis on the sort of oral nature of this, which is maybe strange to modern people, that Muhammad did not know how to write, or in some accounts, he didn't know how to write very well. So the important thing here is that he didn't get, this revelation from a book. He learned it directly from God. And there's a real importance in Islam on the ability to memorize and to recite passages from the Quran as a way of getting closer to God. And another important thing about the Quran is that it's discouraged to read it in translation. You should ideally read it in the original Arabic of the 600s, because any translation will have some kind of inaccuracy. You can't, no matter how hard you try, you can't make a perfect translation. So learning Arabic is another important thing in Islam. No matter where you come from, you can benefit from learning to understand this text on its own terms. And it teaches about monotheism. It teaches about God's plan for the world, teaches you the methods, the ways to be a good person. And so there's some strong ideas on, do this. This is the proper way to live. But it gets a little confused, actually, because not everything that is believed is from the Quran. So you may or may not find certain ideas in the Holy Book, because there are also a lot of other texts which are known as hadith. And hadith are reports. These are sort of reports about the life of Muhammad, accounts of things that he said or that he did or approved of that weren't actually originally part of the Quran, or weren't really ever part of the Quran. And they're very heavily debated. One of the jobs of Muslim scholars is to decide whether they are authentic, plausible, or inaccurate. And from those accounts of things like, did Muhammad wear his beard a certain length? Maybe that's the length that that people today should wear their beard. How did Muhammad approach this problem? Then maybe that's how we should approach this problem. What that leads is to Sharia, which you might have heard Sharia law. That's just redundant. Basically, it just means the law. It is a law code that is trying to interpret the Quran and trying to interpret the Hadith and establish, justice and good ways of living on earth as official legal practice. But it may be drawing directly from the Quran, or it may be drawing from these Hadith. And there's not just one Sharia. There's many. Different countries have different interpretations of, what their law code should be. So one of the things we're seeing here is that there's not frequently a separation of religious ideas and political ideas in Islam. Now, in the modern world, there's a lot of room for there to be separation of law and religious ideas, but it actually varies from country to country how much is the law code based on ideas from Sharia. And different groups have different sets of hadith, different kinds of Sharia. You might have also heard of a fatwa. Fatwa is a non-binding opinion, but it is considered an authoritative opinion from a scholar of the law, which is known as a mullah. A mullah is being a Muslim religious scholar. And you can have all these interpretations, but the number one thing is it in the Quran? That's the most important thing. You might have also heard the term jihad. It doesn't just mean a holy war. Sometimes it's used that way, but it can mean any kind of struggle. You can have your personal jihad to, be good to your parents, or to go to school on time, or to, achieve the goals that you've set for yourself. Any of those can be a jihad. Some scholars talk about the struggle with yourself for self-control as the greater jihad, and then holy war is the lesser jihad. And sometimes holy war is emphasized, sometimes it's not. It really depends on the time and place. We may be more familiar with more intense ideas of Islam, but that's not really true everywhere, or even in all countries today. And one more important idea in Islam is the avoidance of idolatry, which is making images. The avoidance of making images, especially in a religious context, especially of holy figures. You might have heard that one is not supposed to make images of Muhammad. That is important. But in general, there's a big idea that, that one should avoid making images of God or of holy things. And this isn't officially banned by the Quran, but this is a strong tendency that we see because the Quran does condemn the idea of worshiping images. And so if you think back to Judaism, that was one of the things that set the Jews apart, as that the Jews would not worship images of their God. And in Christianity, it gets a bit different because a lot of traditions say that you can have images of the saints and things like that, and you can make images of God. But Islam is going back to the ideas from Judaism and saying, let's avoid religious imagery. Okay, so I think that's quite a lot to digest here. So I'm going to end the video here. We'll pick up with a discussion of some more ideas from Islam, especially having to do with gender roles and some Islamic art and architecture.